The Legislative Assembly of Prince Edward Island has tabled a historic bill that would limit the use of non-disclosure agreements in cases involving sexual misconduct. Now, if passed, the law would be the first of its kind in Canada. Joining me to talk about that is P.E.I. MLA Lynne Lund. Lynne, thanks for your time.
Thank you for having me.
How often are these disclosure and non-disclosure agreements used?
Way more often than anyone would realize. It's the sort of problem that thrives in secrecy. And frankly, I asked these questions in the legislature recently, and as a result of that, I had an inpouring of people reaching out and explaining to me about how non-disclosure agreements had impacted them. So it's far more pervasive than anyone would realize.
What comes with that agreement? What does it entail, and what are you hearing from people about how it affects them?
Yeah, it's an interesting situation because so many of the stories that have been told to me, even though they're really different, they all follow a very similar pattern. And people enter into these agreements after they have experienced sexual misconduct, harassment, discrimination. They're not ready to go to the police. They're not ready to report, but they need help. They want to get out of this situation. So when they are offered a settlement agreement complete with a non-disclosure, they generally take it, because they believe that's what's going to allow them to move on. But they quickly discover that that's not the case, because the wording in these agreements are so broad. They're left with the impression they're not allowed to speak to the police, that they're not allowed to speak to their healthcare provider, they cannot speak to a mental health support worker. They often actually believe that they're not allowed to report under other federal enactments like P.E.I. They can't say where this money came from. And then on the flip side of that, it allows these perpetrators to continually stay in these spaces undetected and become serial harassers. So it's quite problematic.
So but the agreements, I imagine, don't actually stop them from having the right to go to police.
You're absolutely right, but that's the problem. It assumes that people have a very high level of legal literacy, and that's just plainly not what people experience. So when they are passed these agreements, often under duress, they're given 24, 36 hours in many cases to sign them. They believe that this will be withheld. And we've heard from lawyers across the country that if someone actually challenged this, if they went to a judge and asked if it had to be upheld, many times the judge would side to say, no, this is unenforceable. It's just if a person is to come forward and test that and the judge doesn't side with them, they've already broken the terms of their NDA, so they would be at risk of being sued. That's why the law around this really needs to be clarified.
Okay, so what are you putting in the new law? What are you asking for?
Yeah, there's two basic things. Basically, number one, if we are talking about allegations of sexual misconduct, harassment, discrimination, anything like that, a non-disclosure provision can't be standard in the settlement agreement. That's where we need to cut that off. But the second component of that is it can be under certain circumstances, such as if the victim requests it. And in that case, the victim first has to have the option of independent legal advice, so they know exactly what the four corners of the agreement are, what they're signing. And it also spells out in legislation a list of people that you would always be able to talk to.
Are you saying a lot of times the victims here are not seeking legal advice before signing these documents?
Oh, absolutely. The vast majority of the people that I've spoken to on this have not had legal advice. So they believe that these broad, sweeping terms are the letter of the law. And that's not necessarily the case.
Okay, sorry, I cut you off. You're saying they should seek legal advice or should be allowed to as part of, or I guess, the new law if it passes.
Exactly. They would have an opportunity to have legal advice so they actually know what it is they're signing. And then there would be a list of people that they're always able to speak to, like your mental health supports, like your doctor, like your any federal enactment or provincial enactment that you are required to report under. People are getting money from these agreements and believing they can't report that to their unemployment insurance, for example, and they run the risk of getting in a lot of trouble. So it's really problematic.
Is there support for this legislation?
I think it would be difficult for any MLA in our legislature to make a case for why we should continue to support silencing victims, why we should be allowing perpetrators to hide behind NDAs. And I don't expect anyone in the legislature to take that stance, but I'll be interested in hearing what people bring forward.
Lynne Lund, appreciate you stopping in. Thanks for giving us an update. Let us know how it goes.
Thank you for your interest.